Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by folks who have used the historical collections in the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Penelope Dean is Professor of Architecture at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Penelope, thanks for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it you're researching and writing about at the moment?
Uh, yes, what I'm looking at right now in my research is trying to figure out the answer to a very simple question, which is how did design and business culture evolve to such an extent that it's very difficult today to figure out where one starts and the other ends? So that's the contemporary question. One of the ways I'm going about answering this question is to look at a number of industrial designers based in Chicago between the mid-50s and mid-80s who were also in a way concerned with engaging with business culture in a very different way than had been done historically with the business person as a patron. So all of these designers, Jay Doblin and Richard Latham, two of them had passed through the office of Raymond Loewy, whose archive is held at Hagley. And it was there I've discovered that they learned how to appropriate aspects of business culture within the design office to actually advance their standing in corporate culture or within an institution. So that's the broad subject matter, I guess. Methodologically, this is entailing framing the research through two kinds of history, business history and design history, and looking at the intersection, where those two histories intersect.
It seems like a potentially really rich intersection there between business and design.
Yes, I mean, one of the interesting things is to trace how ideas migrated across fields. So how business managerial ideas, managerial theories, marketing ideas migrated into design culture. And then I think later on, and perhaps this is more of a sort of contemporary endpoint, is how design thinking and words like innovation and creativity made their way into business culture. So it's a two-way acculturation of ideas and techniques and theories.
Mm-hmm. What initially drew your attention to the subject?
That's a great question because I'm actually an architectural critic and historian. So I'm dealing with material that is sort of a little bit outside of where most of my work has been. But what drew me to the subject matter was really this idea of design itself. This also happens in architectural culture as well, being redefined as something beyond simply being about form or aesthetics, and something that then, can include the process or how things are done or how things are thought about. So it's a sort of shift away from understanding design as an object or a product or a building into a way of thinking about how something can be done, a method or a process. So it's sort of from the material to the immaterial.
Hmm. Is there something about that period you're looking at, from the 1950s through the 1980s, that really makes this theme rise to the surface?
Yes, I think there are a number of things happening in this period in terms of development within marketing. Specifically, there's a shift in thinking about what gets manufactured towards who is the recipient or the buyer of that object. So we get a shift from talking about products to really redefining the consumer or trying to understand who is this person that buys all of these things. And that actually connects into something else I was looking at in the Hagley Museum, which is the work of Ernest Dichter and motivational studies and all of the surveys and interviews and research that is taking place behind the scenes for businesses, and it sort of reaches its heyday maybe in the late 50s, early 60s. And so I think that it's that shift from the thinking about products to the consumer, and then all of the research that starts to happen around the consumer that's informing this shift also from ideas of business reaching design.
Is that primarily a one-way street in terms of influence and the movement of ideas from business into design, or is there also a feedback going on there?
Oh, there's absolutely a feedback, and I think it does happen. Initially, I think it's one way, but I think it's not, it's not an easy one way shift. And when I talk about one way, I talk about the consumer research into business. And so there are a lot of researchers, even earlier in the 40s and 40s, trying to understand the consumer. And they're producing a lot of data, but there are very few people who are able to convert that data into a language that people understand, business people understand. And I think that some of designers, I think Raymond Loewy in particular, understood that one of the things design could offer was a way to translate this objective, factual information into a language business people could understand through visual, graphs and charts and things like that. Once they achieved that, they could then internalize this knowledge and started to hire, some sociologists into the firm, and could actually start to produce their own form of consumer research as a design service and then offer that back to business. So you're absolutely right. It is a two-way exchange, but it evolves over time, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It's historically situated.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
Could you perhaps tell us who Raymond Loewy was, especially for
Oh,
those of us unfamiliar?
sure. Raymond Loewy was an industrial designer who came to the US from France and established an office in New York at the beginning of the 20th century. A highly influential industrial designer who many industrial designers then worked for and set up their own offices. But he was responsible for designing Greyhound buses, refrigerators like Frigidaire, packages for Nabisco. So all of these well-known brands of everyday culture. He had his hand in designing their logos, their machines, their packages. Lucky Strike cigarettes, he did the logo for that, etc. So many of the things that we use and recognize were in fact designed by his office. Yes, so I'm happy to talk more about him in relation to the designers I've been looking at, if that's helpful.
Oh, yes, please.
So the two designers I've been, researching, Jay Doblin and Richard Latham. Jay Doblin was based in the New York office and was actually helped start up the market planning division in Raymond Loewy's office, which was around 1950. So this is also significant because initially Loewy was designing objects, packages, things we could touch. And then came the marketing division where they produced reports, business reports. So this is very unusual, I think, historically, even though it's very common today. It was unusual at the time. Now, Doblin worked on the Nabisco commission. He also designed some of the refrigerators for Frigidaire. So he was one of the designers in Raymond Loewy's office working on these projects. Richard Latham headed up the Chicago office for Raymond Loewy. So Raymond Loewy also had offices in different places in the world, Paris, Chicago, two of them. And Latham was head of that one and worked on the armor meat company's identity as well. They were also working on the design of gas stations for Amoco in the 50s as well.
Did these designers have a particular style or I know Loewy is very much associated with streamlined
Yes, yes.
designs. Were those working under him also influenced by that?
I think initially they were. However, I think one of the reasons that Doblin decided to leave the office in 1955, and then he became the director of the School of Design at IIT in Chicago, was because he was skeptical of simply styling up the outside of an object, which, as you say, is known as streamlining. He felt that design could do more. And so he was quite critical in his writings of this sort of, superfluous stuff being added to products simply so that they would sell. So in this is also a critique of how how marketers were trying to persuade consumers to buy things, and also the obsolescence of the products as their style changed every year. So yes, there was influence. There was also rejection of it. And one of the reasons that he went into, trying to understand design from a business perspective was because he thought that he could, objects should be functional and useful, and made well for the consumer. And so he sort of rejected some of the more decorative aspects of design. Richard Latham, on the other hand, went in to establish a new line of design called design planning, which I think he may have learned through working with General Electric at Raymond Loewy. So that was less actually about designing objects than it was figuring out what are all the preconditions that you need to figure out before you design a product. So, for example, who wants it? What are people looking for in an object? What are the costs of it? How is it going to be made? All of those things which happen in a way to form a brief for a design of a product as opposed to the actual design of the product, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Please tell me if I'm being too abstract here, because this is actually very abstract. What they're all doing is very abstract as a service, I guess, to a
Mm-hmm.
corporation.
Well, I suppose this brings in what you had mentioned of design as a process.
Yes.
Could you perhaps unpack that and make it a little more concrete for us?
Sure. So design as a process entails thinking about it as a form of research. So defining a problem, analyzing the problem, producing kind of metrics for the problem. Let's to use a more contemporary word, metrics, which would mean going out and interviewing customers, or doing surveys, asking them what they were looking for in a product, what they liked about a product, then converting that into sort of data, which would then help shape, the brief for a particular design. They would then synthesize that information, and then represent it back to the executive. With it also entailed understanding a market, who's buying the product, is the market segmented, do we need to reach new kinds of consumers that we haven't been reaching before? So it's market data, it's customer data, sometimes it's to do with dealers, the cost of materials, it's all of that, which then goes into and precedes the actual making of an object. Does that clarify it a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. Sure. Now, I'm wondering what materials in the Hagley collections you accessed to help you to tell this story.
Sure. Well, obviously, I went into the Raymond Loewy archive. I looked at the scrapbooks, which are, phenomenal in their comprehensiveness. So that's where Loewy obviously had people in his office cutting out every single thing that was ever written about him in newspapers and put into the scrapbook. So I looked at those. I looked at correspondences for certain commissions that I looked at the designs for certain products from Frigidaire, Nabisco Packaging, International Harvester, and client correspondences. And then I also looked at his speeches. He was a prolific lecturer. So I reviewed those materials as well, really with the hope of finding out where these Chicago characters fitted into his office. It also is clear that he did the authorship was largely his, so it's very difficult to tell who actually did what. The other piece that I looked at were the records from the IDCA, which is the Industrial Designers Society of America. And I looked at their newsletters and conference material, because I was also trying to figure out how the characters I'm looking at fitted into the professional society. What's very interesting to note is that all of these ideas that are passing between business and design aren't just going from corporations into a design office, but they're passing through the professional organization in terms of conferences and newsletters, and they're also feeding through academic institutions. So it's a very complex exchange of ideas, which are, sort of connecting corporate culture, academic culture, professional societies, and design practice together. So that was very helpful to look at those records. And then the last piece I looked at super briefly was some of the Ernest Dichter reports, specifically reports that overlapped with work that Raymond Loewy had done, because I also wanted to understand the motivational research perspective. And so I looked at, some of the letters that Dichter had been sending to corporations, where he was extremely proactive in advertising his services and trying to get work. And I was surprised to learn that several corporations by the 1970s had seen his work as not helpful or objective enough anymore for the cultural moment. So, yeah.
Was there a certain set of sources or a certain document in those collections that really made the light bulb go off and really made some connections that are useful for your research?
Oh, I think the big takeaway was the interconnectedness of all of these ideas. I think that for me, it wasn't that it was one document per se, but it was the overlap and reiteration of ideas in just different places. That was for me what was, that it was sort of a concentration of activity, almost like a contagion of ideas across these different worlds and figures. So for me, I know that doesn't answer your question directly, but for me, that was really the big takeaway. And subsequently, I must add, just 2 weeks ago, I was at the Library of Congress looking at the other half of the Raymond Loewy collection, because Hagley has one chunk of it and the Library of Congress has the other chunk. And what was really great for me was Hagley had wonderful photographs of all of the products from Frigidaire and Nabisco and International Harvester. And then Library of Congress had all the reports. I don't know if how that worked out, but it was also really helpful for me to say, oh, this report is behind that photograph. So this is a tough project because these archives are all over the country, and I'm trying to piece together a story where the information is everywhere. But yes. So again, I guess that goes back to the sort of idea of contagion where, you know, one thing's happening here, but it's also having impact in other places. And then informing how industrial design is actually taught in design schools, like the one at IIT here in Chicago.
Mm-hmm. Could you perhaps give us an example of one of these ideas that at that time was circulating between the business cultural world, the world of design, and the institutions in between?
Sure. Well, one of the ideas that I've seen used is this technique called the semantic differential, which comes out of psychology. I mean, this is a very oblique answer to your question, but it is a graph that gets produced from a questionnaire. And the questionnaire might be, say, going to a customer and asking them to evaluate what they think of a car like a Chrysler car, for example. And then the customer is given a range of responses that they can circle a dot for, which range from good to okay to bad, let's say. That's a very generic set of, a range. 150 people might fill out this survey. And then what happens, and this is what Doblin did with this technique, was to draw a graph and then use it to place how a customer perceives that product in relationship to other products. So, for example, is a Chrysler seen as a mainstream car or super expensive? And then they would graph the response and say, well, it's not really a Jaguar, but it could be like this. So it's a way to also relativize products in the market. So this comes out of psychology. It's invented in the 50s. It gets appropriated by a designer, presented to a business, and placed on a marketing map with all other kinds of brands. And then the designer can say, all right, you're seen as, average. We want to move you to be seen as elite, let's say. This is all hypothetical. So it provided a strategy. So that's an example of a really specific process and technique of evaluating something and then figuring out where it should go in a market in comparison to other things. Now, this also gets done for JCPenney when Jay Doblin is commissioned by them as part of his firm Unimark to reimagine their corporate identity. So that's one example. Another example would be the focus group or calling 150 consumers and asking their opinion about a particular product, and then presenting that consumer response to a business to say, this is what they think of you. We see an opportunity here in this market. To get to this market, you have to do X, which might be change the color, market it differently, give it a new logo, position it differently on a supermarket shelf. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, Penelope, it's such a rich and fascinating subject. Thank you for taking the time to share it with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.